Hi, this is Joe Hage. I have the privilege of leading your medical devices group, which, as of this recording, has 353,000 members worldwide, and I'm delighted to bring Beth Brooks back to you. She is the founder of Decision Driver Analytics, now part of TTI, and she is my go-to for all matters having to do with health economics, outcomes research, and reimbursement. And we are here today to talk about clinical evidence generation strategies. Beth, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Joe. And I think most of you probably heard Joe talking about my being sick. I have had laryngitis for the past 5 days or so. It's doing better today, but if my voice gives out, I apologize. And my colleague April is ready to jump in at any point if that happens. But if you hear me sounding like I have candy in my mouth or something like that, it's a cough drop. So I'm working to get through this, but I'm so glad to be here today to talk with you. And I'd just like to start with this quote that's been on the screen in front of you. The FDA's evidence requirements are usually pretty black and white. What does the market need to see? That's more grayscale. So really, if you think about it, that's quite a quote. And I've heard that same sentiment over the years, over and over again. You know, the FDA's requirements are usually fairly straightforward. They might be difficult, they might be daunting, but they can be understood. And that's really what most of our clients say. But what the market actually wants, what your customers want, is usually more difficult to understand. There aren't formal guidelines that help us through those interactions with our key customer stakeholders. And so having said all of that, you know, what is your clinical evidence generation strategy? And while it's not written here, what I mean is, what's your evidence generation strategy to support market access for your product? If what your customers want to see isn't clear, where do you start? And that's a place that we really have begun with so many of our clients. If it's not clear what they want, how do we even get started? How do we get on that pathway? And so we're here to share some lessons learned, to talk about different things that have worked, and then at the end of the webinar, really to answer questions that you may have about your specific situation. So before we really just dive into all of that, I want to make sure that we set the stage the right way and make sure that everybody's working from the same understanding of what we mean by market access, because there are different definitions that are out there. So what is market access? Well, you know, if you think about it on the face of it, we might think that market access is the same thing as regulatory approval, but it's really not. There's really a subtle difference. Regulatory approval gives you the permission that you need to sell to the market. So it says, okay, sure, you can take your new technology and you can sell it to the market, but it doesn't give you full market access. It doesn't give you what your customers need to buy it. You have permission to sell, but it doesn't mean that they're going to buy. So what we mean by market access is actually the really complicated and protracted process. And I'm sure you guys, so many of you are very well aware of how complicated and protracted it can be. But to ensure that two things are happening. One is that your technology is made available to patients, that physicians and facilities are wanting to utilize your technology. And then secondly, that it's being paid for, that somebody's paying you for that technology. And if those two things aren't in place, then you don't really have market access. So as we, continue talking about this, we've talked about the move from regulatory approval to market access. Which is actually harder? Is it regulatory approval or is it market access? Actually getting your customers to make available your technology and to pay for it. So you probably have some idea already of where I'm going with this. But, I love this image of what regulatory approval looks and feels like. It's an incredible accomplishment. You've cleared the evidence hurdle that was laid out for you by the regulatory authority, and it feels great, and it should feel great. Whether it's your first product or your 500th product, getting regulatory approval feels really, really good. And that's not something that, we should take lightly or underestimate. But the problem is that if you're not prepared for what's next, this is what you're going to face. If you're not prepared, as you clear that hurdle of regulatory requirements, you're going to run smack into this brick wall of evidence requirements that are necessary for market access. And that obviously is a problem. So why can it be a brick wall? So why, once you have FDA approval, can you run into this brick wall? And really it comes down to the fact that the evidence that you generate for regulatory approval is not the same evidence that the market wants to see to adopt and pay for your technology. The FDA wants basically short-term safety and efficacy data. The market wants longer-term safety effectiveness data, which means effectiveness versus efficacy means that it shows that it actually works in actual use versus in a very tightly defined patient population. And they also want cost effectiveness data under real world conditions. And so those two evidence requirements are really challenging. And so given that, are market access challenges inevitable? Well, yes, they are, but to varying degrees. And so everybody's going to have trouble with market access when right after you get regulatory approval and you first launch in the marketplace. But you can be prepared and you can have a much softer landing. So the way we like to think about it is that your transition from approval to market access can look more like this, where instead of leaping over the hurdle of regulatory approval and smashing into the side of the wall of market access, you vault off that hurdle and you land on this evidence ladder. And the rungs on the ladder, we like to think of as incremental steps in the evidence generation strategy. And the truth is that honestly, if your customers just know that you're on that ladder and they know that you're on the path to working to provide the evidence that they need, that's already a positive. So just think for a second about the difference in perspective. You know, one response to the market could be, well, we have FDA approval, for heaven's sakes. That shows we're not experimental and investigational. What more do you want? That could be one response, and it's one response that I've heard a lot of times, versus saying, you know what, we totally get it. We know that you need longer-term safety and effectiveness and cost-effectiveness information, but we just launched. We don't have all of that data yet, but here's our plan. Here's our plan for generating data. Here's how we're going to generate more, and here's how we can work together to get the evidence that you need. Those are two very different places to be. And so again, it's important to land on that ladder, you know, show the market that you're working to climb the rungs of the ladder and give them the evidence that they need. And that's really, really important. Okay, so what we'd like to focus on now is, you know, what we refer to as our playbook for market access. And there's obviously lots of different elements in that playbook, but here we're going to focus on evidence generation. And I've picked a quote here that might seem a little bit odd, but hopefully it'll make sense once I kind of talk through it. And that's, strong words cannot be strong evidence. And so again, that might seem like an odd quote, but it fits from where we're sitting. So I can't tell you how many times, again, that I've heard people say, but it's just a no-brainer that our technology will be cost-effective and it's going to benefit patients and it's going to benefit payers. Look at the data we have from the FDA. Common sense tells you that this is going to work. I mean, I've heard this over and over again. And some of those people think that if you just speak loudly enough or forcefully enough about that, that you can convince the market that you're right without having the evidence to back it up. So that's strong words, but not strong evidence. And it just doesn't work that way ultimately. And so now you'll probably all be happy to hear, I'm going to take a little bit of a break and I'm going to let my colleague, April Zambelli-Weiner, who is the president and founder of TTI, who's now our parent company, talk to you for a few minutes. And then we're going to be kind of going back and forth through the rest of the presentation. So April?
Great, thanks. So what does evidence generation mean? Well, you need evidence to tell your value story, to get adoption, to get payment, to meet funding milestones. And data and evidence are not interchangeable, although we often see people using them interchangeably. So generating evidence means providing data that is meaningful to the appropriate context, or providing data that's relevant and provides proof that supports a conclusion. And so what is that conclusion that we're wanting to support? The conclusion is that your product is cost effective, that your product saves money, it improves patient outcomes, it improves the delivery and quality of healthcare. So it's not just data, it's evidence that you have to generate. And I think that, most of us are probably familiar with RCTs or randomized controlled trials, but that's really just one way to generate data. And it's certainly not the only way. And we've listed a few examples here of other types of study designs that we often use to help generate an evidence base for our clients. And you'll be seeing us talk about some of these throughout the presentation today, so I'm not going to spend too much time here on them. But I did want to reiterate just one point that's already brought up, which is, as we've discussed, the FDA wants short-term efficacy and safety data. And that's appropriate for a technology to gain approval to be sold in the market. But short-term safety and efficacy are not sufficient or particularly meaningful to a payer's decision-making process or to a facility's decision-making process, nor to a physician's decision-making process. So what is the key takeaway here? Evidence generation is not a one-size-fits-all activity. Different stakeholders will accept different evidence at different points to meet different market access requests. For example, if your ask of a facility is that they perform a trial of your technology, do you think they'll require less evidence than if you ask them to replace every single product they're currently using with your product? That's the secret to market access. Make the ask match what you have to offer at each rung on the ladder.
Okay, thank you, April. And now we'd kind of like to, now that we've set the stage, we want to go through some of the common pitfalls that we've seen over our years of working with medical device manufacturers. And we'd like to start here because, as the quote indicates, it's through mistakes, whether they're our own mistakes or they're others' mistakes, that can show us the way. And so we have a top 5 list here of common pitfalls that we'd like to walk through. So what's the first pitfall? It's really simple. It's thinking that your regulatory data is enough. It's enough to support utilization and reimbursement by the market. And now, in terms of sample scenarios, where have we seen this? With what types of products and what types of clients? We've seen it all across the board, from companies who have 510K products or PMA products. They've had a wide range of regulatory requirements. They might have had to generate no clinical data at all in the case of some of the 510Ks, or they might have had a really extensive data generation requirement for the FDA in the case of some PMA applications. So there's all kinds of variability there, but all of them had a belief that the key stakeholder, whether that was a payer or a facility or a provider, was primarily interested in the same data that they'd already generated. And so what happens then if you fall into that category, if you make that mistake, thinking your regulatory data is enough? The payer's response is always going to be the same. You're not covered, experimental and investigational. And, I have seen this again over and over again with clients who have said, well, what do they mean, experimental and investigational? It has FDA approval. That means it's not experimental and investigational. But from the payer's perspective, it is still experimental and investigational because you haven't proven the evidence that they need to see. And so, the sub-statement that I have there is short-term safety and efficacy data do not sufficient evidence make. And that sounds a little bit Yoda-like, actually, as I say it out loud, but I wasn't necessarily trying to do that. But the point is that, short-term safety and efficacy data are not what payers want to see, and it's also not what a facility wants to see. So here's a sample, value analysis committee response. Okay, nope, we're not approving your product. we can't tell, the impact that this technology could have on our overall budgets. We just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen to patient outcomes. We don't know what's going to happen to our costs. So, no, we're not going to trial your technology. So either way, the bottom line is that market access isn't going to happen with just your regulatory evidence alone. April, I'll switch it back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Beth. So pitfall number 2, reliance on academic partners. We encounter this all the time. And again, as Beth said, it can happen to any type of client with any type of product. And I think it's important to start by saying that we are not by any means discounting the important role of academic partners. What we are saying is that letting academic partners drive your evidence generation train or strategy can be a pitfall and a real setback. Academic investigators, they represent another stakeholder group with who have different priorities and pressures that are distinct from you as the sponsor. And so it's really about recognizing that and managing the process so it's a win-win. We often see this with limited study budgets where sponsors believe that objective data is better than sponsored data. But at the end of the day, it's about having the right data. Next slide. So what happens under this scenario? These are just a few of the typical results. You have a bunch of studies conducted and published, but none of them are favorable. Maybe they're not unfavorable, but they don't necessarily tell your value story the way it needs to be told. Or maybe now you're 3 years out and you're still waiting for those results. When you relinquish control, you relinquish all control. Or maybe you have multiple favorable studies published, but none of them get you to the evidence bar that's required. And we've seen all of these happen a lot. Significant delays in market access and unfavorable coverage decisions or other business opportunities disappearing because the evidence base has not been built properly to support the product. Beth, I'll flip it back to you.
Okay. So what's the next most common pitfall that we encounter? Here it's really just inside the box thinking that can happen, in multiple ways. So here are a few samples. First, we've talked about this a little bit already, but the first is that, even any evidence that we generate has to be from a randomized controlled trial. Any evidence that we generate has to be for the broadest possible patient population. If our technology is to be used in asthma, then we have to conduct a study where we let in all comers, all patients with asthma. And, finally, another sample is, it has to be compared to the gold standard treatment. That whatever that gold standard is, that's the one that we have to choose to compare our technology to. And, those can all be right in certain circumstances, but they can also all be wrong and can really set you off down the wrong pathway. So what can happen if you only think inside the box, as it were? One thing that can happen is that necessary study, that RCT with an all-comer patient population is so huge and so expensive that it's a non-starter. You can't possibly afford to conduct that study. And so you're left thinking, well, now what do I do? Now, do I just make do with what I have and hope to get enough revenue in eventually that we can afford that study? That happens quite a bit. Another example is that you do conduct that study with the gold standard comparator, and the payers come back and they say, nope, we're still denying coverage because we don't think that's the right comparator. It can be a case where the gold standard might be a really invasive surgical procedure, and your procedure is minimally invasive, but there's some other covered minimally invasive alternatives, and the payers think, well, you really should have compared against one of those. We cover those technologies, and that to us makes more sense. And so you've generated all this data and it's still not the right data for the payer. That certainly can happen. And, the third thing that can happen is, third of many, is that, you have a positive impact in a subpopulation that's masked by a lesser impact across all patients. And so again, you've conducted this really large study that was powered to show a result across the whole population. You didn't achieve that result, but you had a great result in a subpopulation, or you could have, but your study wasn't powered in that group. And so now again, you're left with, less than ideal evidence to support your market access. So it's something that you really should try to understand and avoid, that inside the box thinking, or at least, thought about it enough to know that inside the box is right for you and that there's not another path. So April?
So this is another common pitfall that we encounter. Only perfect is good enough. And as a recovering perfectionist, I personally have a lot of appreciation for this pitfall. And this definitely can be true in a clinical evidence generation setting or strategy. And this plays out a couple of different ways. The first is, our technology isn't perfect yet. Why generate and publish data when we're still tweaking? Technologies and go through different development cycles, different iterations, and that varies depending on the type of technology. But we've seen clients stall out and not move forward with generating clinical data because they are already envisioning the next several iterations of their product and they want to wait until it's perfect. And the other way this plays out really is a segue from the prior pitfall, which is we can't afford to conduct the perfect post-market study, so we'll just wait and see what we can do with our regulatory evidence. And both can really have significant impacts on market access. And I think the important bottom line is that establishing thought leadership in your space and a track record is extremely important to gathering the support that you're going to need for your technology, for market access, for attracting investors, and for creating early or even later revenue opportunities. So, what have we seen happen as a result of this? No track record, no publications, no data, and it stalls access. So slow market uptake, frustrated investors, and sometimes, unfortunately, company failure. And again, just to reiterate that demonstrating the maturation of your technology and your business through presentations, through white papers, peer-reviewed publications, even if it's not perfect, is powerful and essential for market access. And the lack of such a track record really can erode confidence and dramatically slow market access to the point of jeopardizing the product line or even the company.
Okay, so what's the final pitfall that we'll talk about today? The final pitfall is really thinking you know everything there is to know about your product and thinking you know exactly what your customers think is important about your product, what your product's true value proposition is to the market. And so again, we've got a couple of common scenarios, that we've highlighted here. The first is, well, look, we've spoken with 20 physicians and they all say that if we can reduce time in the OR, that's important. And that's where the value of our technology is. So that's one example. Another example is, okay, well, our diagnostic is more specific in ruling out cancer patients. So, who doesn't want that? Payers are going to cover it. If they rule out cancer patients, we're going to build our value story based on that proposition. So why would we need to talk with them? We know that ruling out cancer patients would be important to payers and help them from going down a wrong pathway. Ultimately, it's going to save them money. We know what we're talking about. And so in both of those cases, you're assuming something. You're assuming that you know something that you really don't. And it's really important to avoid falling into that trap, because here's what can happen. So when you actually go to sell your product that saves time in the emergency and in the operating room, you're going to a value analysis committee. there's certainly going to be an OR manager on that value analysis committee, and they're going to say, yep, okay, you saved 30 minutes per case, but we only have one of those cases per day on a high volume day. And if you save us 30 minutes, we can't put an extra procedure in there. So that really doesn't mean anything to us. So ultimately, you've given them something, but you didn't give them anything that was meaningful for them to act on. That wasn't the value proposition for the OR manager. And the OR manager was actually a key person on that value analysis committee decision-making process. And here's another one with payers. And if those of you who have heard me speak before, you've heard me talk time and time again about how diagnostics are tough. And they're tough for this very reason. Payers say, okay, your diagnostic is more specific, which means that, it doesn't identify false positive cancer patients, but we know how physicians behave. Physicians are worried about missing something. And so very often when there's a new, more specific diagnostic, physicians are going to say, okay, well, yeah, I see that it's negative, but you know what? I've been using this other diagnostic for a long time. I'm just going to run that diagnostic too, just to make sure I'm not missing something. And so what happens for the payer is that the payer covers your technology. They end up paying for both things. And so they're not going to do that. So again, think you know the value proposition, but you didn't really understand the value to the payer or what needed to be demonstrated to the payer in that case. Okay, so now that we've gone through those top 5 pitfalls, what we'd really like to do is talk you through some case studies about how we've overcome each of those pitfalls in the past. And in almost all cases, we're really not talking about a single technology or client, but multiple clients that we've helped in the same way. So some of the case studies are a little bit vaguely worded so that it's applicable to multiple different clients and situations. So that's why that's happening, because it's just something we encounter pretty frequently. And I think only in one of the cases do we actually have one specific technology and indication in mind, and we'll talk about that. So April, I'm going to let you take over for this first case study.
Okay, great. So this first case study involves making the most of regulatory data. Here we have a common scenario where we have clients who know they don't have enough data from regulatory approval, but they weren't sure how to really maximize that data or supplement it to get them on that evidence ladder that we've been talking about. And so our job in these cases is really to provide them with some budget-friendly solutions for generating comparative data from multiple perspectives. And so in this case, go ahead, Beth, flip to the next slide, please. Thanks. So in this case, what we were able to do was to design a series of small studies to really maximize the data that had already been collected in regulatory studies. And in this case, one case in particular that I'm thinking about, we were able to conduct 3 studies that resulted in 3 peer-reviewed manuscripts within approximately a year period. So it was pretty fast. And those 3 studies involved a mixed mode study, which was a facility perspective study, and that really involved collecting facility level charge data and utilizing administrative claims database to perform a comparative facility-based analysis. In another administrative database analysis that was from the payer perspective, and then a case match study, which again was facility perspective. So in this case, we used an economic case report form that we developed, and that was administered to the facilities that were already engaged in clinical studies. And we collected data on both the sponsor technology, but also comparator technologies. And we were able to match on important variables that really minimize the impact of confounding to really create a very robust comparative study in that case. And so the outcome there is that clients have been able to achieve rapid uptake of their technologies due to the availability of solid evidence at product launch. And again, by kind of having some of that out of the box thinking, we were able to really expedite the creation of their evidence base.
Okay, great. And so jumping into the second case study, this is really the case where a client has chosen to go the investigator-initiated study route. They've decided to kind of, minimize their financial outlay and getting, academic investigators who were really interested in technology to conduct a bunch of different studies that they didn't have to sponsor. And so in this case, I'm thinking in particular about a radiotherapy device that's used in breast cancer. And this client was a well-established medical device firm, and they'd utilized investigator-initiated studies, as I described, as their primary market access strategy. And so what had happened is there were a lot of studies out there, a lot of studies that showed, benefit of their technology, but it was really just a hodgepodge of information aside from that. There was inconsistency in terms of the patient populations, in terms of the outcomes that were measured, the follow-up time frame, so on and so forth. So there was a bunch of good stuff out there, but none of the individual studies was quote unquote good enough. And none of them provided really what the market was looking for. And in this case, the market meant the payers as well as the providers. What they really all wanted to see to make it consistent with other technologies that were the gold standard treatments was a 5-year recurrence rate. And that wasn't anywhere to be seen in all of this investigator-initiated research. So in this case, what did we do? The solution here was to conduct a systematic literature review and perform a meta-analysis to obtain that predicted 5-year recurrence rate, and then also determining the appropriate confidence interval around that. So it was a way of, rigorously and methodically combining the data from all those disparate studies in a way that gave the payers and the providers what they wanted. And so the outcome of this was, there's peer-reviewed publication out there that demonstrates the evidence to both payers and providers in the way that they wanted to see it. And so now they're able to reference that, throughout their market access initiatives. So here's another example in terms of our case study 3, breaking out of the box. So this one again applies to multiple clients, multiple technologies, multiple indications. I have a couple specific that are kind of top of mind. So if I lapse into what we did for that specific client, that's why. But we've actually used this kind of breaking out of the box strategy in multiple different scenarios. But here's the situation. We've had multiple clients that they want to prove cost effectiveness of their technology to one or more state Medicaid programs. Let's think about what that means. So any of you who've had to work with state Medicaid programs know that they're tough to work with. So their time frames are long in terms of a decision-making process. Their evidence requirements are tough because they want to see, how your technology works in their specific patient populations. And so they're difficult. But what we've developed over the years is an incremental approach to this that seems to work well with them. And it lets them pass specific smaller gates of evidence to ensure continued funding without asking them for the sun, the moon, and the stars up front. So you're not asking them for a huge amount of money to work with them to generate this data, but you're saying, okay, if we can show you this, then does that give you more comfort and buy-in? Okay, well now let's go to the next step. And so kind of walk through that, scenario in our solution here that we typically, recommend, as we've talked about multiple times already, this multi-phased program, similar to what's described below. The first step can be just convincing the state Medicaid agency of the validity of the recommended analysis. We know what we're doing. We've done this before. We have a plan for collecting the right data. We have a plan for ensuring that your perspective is the one that is primary. What works for you in terms of securing funding? How can we agree on these milestones? So that's really the first phase, and in a lot of cases is just, convincing them that it's the right thing to do. The second phase then can just be, again, it's just an incremental bite. It's a small budget. that, our clients and Medicaid, collaboratively can agree on. And that's, well, we're going to design and conduct a pilot study to de-risk the larger study, because that's a concern, of many of our clients, obviously, and it's a concern if you're working with Medicaid or with any other payer directly. They don't want to take on that risk before they know something. And again, this is similar to the formative research that we've discussed previously as well. Make sure you know that you're able to prove what you're trying to prove before you have the huge financial outlay. And so once you've de-risked the study, then okay, well now we can design and execute the larger prospective health economic study that's going to be conducted from the right perspective to convince, in this case, the state Medicaid that this is the right way to move forward. And then finally, once that's done, performing the data analysis and developing the health economics model that shows them the impact that this technology could have on their population outcomes and on their overall budgets. And so when we've gone through this multi-phase process in the past with multiple of our clients, the outcome ultimately has been what we were looking for: Medicaid coverage and utilization of those technologies. And again, it was just breaking out of that box of thinking to really focus and get this incremental coverage. Okay, April, I'm going to switch to you.
Sure. So case study 4, sometimes good is good enough. And, this really speaks to the pitfall that we discussed previously. And so we've helped, this goes really across a lot of technologies and indications as well, as we've been saying, but top of mind is really some of the multiple innovative software companies that we have helped who have found themselves in this predicament over the years, and you can understand why that would be a situation that would be really amenable to this situation, because the algorithms are always being improved and tweaked. And so, that's the basic situation. This constant tweaking of the software has led to lack of a track record, no publications, no clinical data. And so, this can have multifaceted ramifications. It can definitely, obviously, impede market access, but it can also get in the way of regulatory approval as well. And so, how do we help our clients in this scenario? Well, similar to what Beth was just saying, we like to propose phased clinical evidence generation strategies that are coupled with a really strong communication plan that starts to really establish the track record of thought leadership and the evidence base that's going to be required to really climb that ladder and open these market access doors across the different stakeholders. And so in a lot of cases, it looks kind of like we've laid it out here, where phase 1 will be a proof of concept, a small sample size, sometimes a qualitative only study, where we're really just trying to show that what the technology can do and how end users feel about it. So oftentimes we'll actually interview end users about the value and utility of the technology clinically. And then that becomes the foundation that we build on that can fuel presentations and publications and get us started down the road of clinical evidence generation. Phase 2 and 3, we like to call as good as and better than, but they can be run concurrently, or they can be run sequentially depending upon funding and other factors. But really the goal of phase 2 is to establish the equivalence of the technology against the current standard of care using a larger sample size. Sometimes it's qualitative, sometimes it's mixed methods, meaning both qualitative and quantitative. And then phase 3 really is the better than, appropriately powered, large-scale quantitative study that really allows well-powered comparative analyses. Back to you, Beth.
Okay, great. And so our last case study here is, really talking about the pitfall of thinking your product's value proposition. So again, we've encountered this with multiple clients and multiple indications, and I have here ranging from basic surgical supplies to implantables to new diagnostics because we really have encountered it just over and over again. And so the situation that we're very commonly presented with is that, we have a client who comes to us and they say, look, we want to conduct this clinical economic study to prove this value proposition, whatever it is. And, we pretty much always say to them at that point, okay, before you spend, $500,000 or more on this large study, how do you know you're going to be able to prove that? And how do you know that that's what you want to prove? How do you know that that's going to be the most meaningful point from your client's perspective? And so again, we're asking them to back up a little bit. And we almost, I say we always, I would maybe say we almost always recommend proceeding with a formative research phase, just to make sure that we know, what we're talking about. Let's talk to, a bunch of your key opinion leaders. Let's talk to stakeholders from purchasing at the facility. Let's talk to the payers. Let's make sure we understand what the value proposition is. We almost always find when we do that, that something in the assumed / known value proposition that came to us isn't right. Maybe it's incomplete, maybe it's just not well formulated, or maybe it's just flat out wrong. There was something that was going to lead us down the wrong path. But conducting this, formative research at the beginning lets us spend just a little bit of money and figure out really what the value proposition is that we should be trying to prove. And that lets us design, the right research program to prove that correct value proposition. And so now that, takes us through, all of our case studies. And so we thought it might be, interesting for you to, see, feedback from a few of our clients. And I'm not going to read these out to you. You're going to have them there after the webinar is over. But we wanted to just highlight a couple of things that some of our clients have said. And in the first example there, we had a client of ours who said, we were really the only company that they worked with that understood both their long-term research vision, but also the short-term steps that could get them there as a smaller company. That we let them be flexible and go about this in an incremental way that matched their budgetary requirements, but still kept them moving up that evidence ladder. And so they really appreciated that opportunity to look and behave as a smaller company, but still get the evidence out there that they needed. And then, the second quote down there, is actually one of my favorites, just because of the language, that it was such a relief to find a company that really, as this client put it, gave a crap about us, about helping us develop the right study. Ultimately they were saying that we cared about them. And again, it was this smaller client perspective of, we had the out-of-the-box thinking, we had the grittiness and the resourcefulness to help them, again, land on that evidence ladder, help them climb that evidence ladder, and get where they needed to be in terms of market access, but doing that under their constraints and understanding and working within their constraints. So let's just take a couple minutes now. I think the timing has worked out pretty well, I think, to kind of talk through the key takeaways. And then we can open it up for questions for me and for April. So April, I'm going to let you take this one.
Sure. So, these are really the things that we wish we could tell every client from the beginning. You have to think about all of your stakeholders, not just FDA. So safety and efficacy data necessary for regulatory approval are rarely sufficient for market access. And then, knowing is half the battle. So just knowing about some of these pitfalls or traps and trying not to let your company fall into them. As we discussed, regulatory data will just have to suffice, or investigator-initiated studies are the way to go. RCTs are the only studies that payers will accept and will look at. If it's not perfect, we should wait. We shouldn't do it. We know what our value story is, so we're just going to go full bore down this path. And I think that if you already find yourself falling into one of these, don't worry. You're not alone. You can course correct. And, with the right people and partners in place, you can leverage what you've already done.
Okay, and that's a perfect segue into our last slide here before we go to questions. And that is, as April just said, even if you've fallen into one of those, pitfalls, there's always a way to get out of it. There's always a way to generate good evidence at market launch or shortly thereafter. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be everything all at once. And in fact, again, I love that image of the evidence ladder, that it's in line with this incremental approach. Take little steps and make hay with each incremental output. So maybe you prove how your technology works in, very high risk asthma patients or difficult to treat asthma patients, and you get coverage in that patient population first. And then from there, you start to expand to larger and larger, patient populations. That's a great pathway that, is eventually going to get you to the very widespread market access that you're looking for. And if you talk about those incremental steps you have planned, that's really important. Again, I talked about this at the very beginning of the presentation. If payers and providers know your strategy and they know the pathway that you've carved out, they know the ladder you're climbing, that really helps a lot. Say, look, this is what I can prove at this time point in order to get you to try my technology for a year in your facility with just these patients and see how it works. And by next year, you're going to have your own evidence that shows that it worked well for you, and we're also going to have conducted these 3 other studies, and that evidence will be out there. So let them know that you're generating the best evidence you can at each step of the way. And when you think about it that way, really think about market access as a series of these small little battles, these incremental steps that are designed to help you win that overall war to widespread adoption and coverage. And so I think we'll leave it there. And Joe, if we can open it up for questions now, I think that works.
There is a nice queue of them, yes. The first came from Guillaume in Paris, and he writes, I have a disruptive, non-invasive technology, and I need to go through a PMA. I'd like to know if you have any info to share regarding the studies that are required, and if these studies will play a role talking to the payers later on.
April, let me jump in first, and then I'll let you, add whatever you'd like to. So that's a great question. And, without knowing details about your technology, there's obviously not, a whole lot terribly specific that I can say, but I can tell you that we've worked with a number of clients in that scenario. It's a PMA, it's a groundbreaking disruptive technology. You obviously are going to have a much higher evidence requirement from the FDA's perspective, first of all, that you'll have to meet. And so in that case, it's really, really important to plan for using that data and supplementing the data that you're getting in that study to meet what the payers want. So for example, if the FDA is going to require, 6 months of follow-up data, but you've spoken to the payers and you know that they're going to want a year of data, you might just design an extension study, do the analysis at 6 months, design the extension to collect the additional data for, another 6 months, so that you have approval and you're still collecting the data that the payers are going to need. Or it can be making sure that you're including in the FDA study that you're collecting medical resource utilization data to ensure that you have an economic story that you can tell at the end of the day. Or if it's a non-comparative PMA study, what data exists already on, the standard of care technologies, and how can we make those two things match up? Or what supplemental research could we perform? So there's lots of different things you can do, as long as you bear in mind what the payers or the providers will want to see at the end. It's a great time to think about that study design before you actually initiate that PMA study. April, is there anything else you'd add?
Nope, that was great.
Mario has a few questions. Before I get to that, I sent to everyone in the chat box the link to the slides. There's also a chance for you to get Beth's 2.5-hour workshop on value analysis committee stuff. It's quite good. Mario asks, should market access, should market access after regulatory approval, should market access after regulatory approval, or can it be performed in a more synchronized way if you are sure of your claim? So can they be done consecutively or in parallel, I guess is the question.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, we always say, you know, the earlier you can start talking with us, the better. So, you know, even, you know, as early in your product development process as you can, start thinking about market access and start thinking about, you know, coordinating and conducting in parallel as much as you can the data requirements that you'll need for the FDA along with the evidence that you'll need for market access. Knowing that, okay, go ahead.
His two follow-up questions you're beginning to touch on. One is,
okay.
redefining endpoints during market access an option after regulatory approval?
So I'm not quite sure what's meant by redefining endpoints. You know, it's certainly true that your endpoints that you would need for regulatory approval may not be the same primary endpoints that the market would want to see. You know, oftentimes with the regulatory study, we'll want you to have secondary or tertiary endpoints that you're considering primarily for those market access purposes, so that you can, you know, kind of refit that data to your market value proposition. But it's very possible that those will be different endpoints. April, did you have anything to add about that?
No, I think that's right. Thanks, Beth.
How about what is the FDA's position on using the Bayesian model instead of p-values for statistics?
Well, the Bayesian model has become accepted by the FDA, but, you know, I'm not a regulatory expert. And so, you know, before you go down that pathway, I would suggest that you speak directly with the FDA about your plan and what you're proposing and get their feedback through the pre-submission process with the FDA.
Mario, I have a few people I can refer to you afterward. Catherine asks, could you discuss more on the balance of sponsored data versus objective data? And how do you best balance that for the sake of the conversations to academics?
April, I'll let you take the first crack at that one so you don't end up just saying, nope, that sounds good.
So I wasn't entirely clear on the question in terms of for the sake of the conversations with academics. But I can take my best stab at it. So, and hopefully if I miss the mark, you can follow up with me afterwards. I'd be happy to discuss this further. But, you know, I think that, you know, you're going to get a lot of interest from academics in your technology, and you want to have those clinical champions and you want to engage those key opinion leaders. And I think that what we advocate is that is a deliberate, strategic, and facilitated process. So when it works best is that even if for example, a company like ours is not conducting the study. So sometimes we are actually conducting the study. Sometimes we are just facilitating the studies. So we are liaising with the academic institutions to help negotiate those protocols and manage that process and ensure that the company's interests are represented and that the company is getting out of it the data that they need to, and that the investigators are getting what they need to as well, so that it's a win-win situation. So I think that where it goes awry is when you're busy running a company, so you don't have time to be sitting on top of your investigators and have a thumb on them all the time. And also you want to preserve that relationship. You want that to be a very positive relationship. And so sometimes when they're just kind of left to their own devices, so to speak, things can go a little astray. Hopefully that addressed the question to some extent.
I guess we should say, Beth, do you have anything to add?
I do not. I thought that was a great answer.
Yes, I agree. Stein asks, with a medical device and a broad intended use, his is arterial and venous, would it be enough to provide data providing examples on arterial and examples on venous and put in the clinical evaluation plan that more patient groups will be included later? Would that be satisfying for CE mark approval? It's more of a regulatory one, but can you take that one?
Yeah, I think we really, again, we're not going to try and provide the regulatory guidance. I'm going to leave that to, a regulatory expert. From a market access perspective, I think if you're doing something similar to that, it's showing that you're on that evidence ladder and you're providing, incremental evidence, and it shows that you're trying to do the right thing. But from a regulatory perspective, I don't think we should address that.
Okay. Ted asks, if you wish to partner with a major manufacturer, is FDA clearance or small trial data more important for negotiations?
So, that's an interesting question. And we have, a lot of our clients are in this scenario where that's really what they're looking for. They're looking to be, either acquired by one of the major medical device manufacturers, or they're looking to partner with them for market access and commercialization. And so regulatory approval can be very important to them. But if you also have additional data that's conducted from more of a market access perspective, and it can be, just small studies, some of the case studies that we walked through where we talked about designing, 3 small studies to kind of maximize the use of the regulatory data. One of those clients that we worked with, they were pre-FDA approval. They'd submitted, but they were also in the process of generating this very market access focused data. And that really got the attention of, one of the major medical device manufacturers and helped in the valuation of their company and their technology. So I would say that, it's not necessary to have FDA approval to facilitate those discussions. It's not necessary to have those, smaller, more focused studies. But I think the more that you can show that you're on the path to establishing the regulatory requirements, and also on the path to establishing the market access requirements, the higher your company and technology will be valued by those major players in the market.
I'm going to assume a one professional person answer for the next couple, so you can spare yourselves the, how about you? Unless you want to just chime in, so let me know. Sean asks, this looks like it's about your services. He wants to know, do you actually provide investigators, or do you just provide the appropriate structure for research?
We can provide both. So, sometimes we're going through the process of, actually identifying the investigators for the study and going through the pre-qualification exercises with them. So we do both things.
Okay. Guillaume comes back and asks, is there a certain minimum of patients that Medicare is expecting for their market access studies?
I would say the short answer to that is no. It depends on, what you're trying to prove, and, looking at an appropriately powered study for Medicare. So we'd need to know something about, the effect size for your technology, what your primary endpoints are to determine what that appropriate study size would be. But no, they don't seem to say, well, we need 100 patients, we need 150 patients. They don't really provide you that kind of guidance.
We have time for just one last question. The rest I'll be sure that Beth gets, and she can answer you after our event. Christy asks a question that I'm really interested in your answer. She asks, if the OR admin isn't interested in saving 30 minutes on a procedure, what are some examples of what that person is interested in?
That's a great question. So the OR admin could be interested in saving, other resources during the surgical procedure. So if it's a technology that, I'm thinking of one specific example that would require, multiple levels of additional personnel in the room, multiple additional nurses, multiple additional physicians, and your technology enables a more, streamlined procedure, not having those extra people in the OR during that execution of that procedure could be something that they would be interested in. The 30 minutes per case, might not make any sense at all to a small volume facility, but if you have a facility who has, multiple ORs that are, packed with cases every day, and they have a high volume of those procedures that you're performing, and in the end you're saving them an hour and a half per operating room in a given day, that gives them enough to do another procedure, they will be interested in that. So again, it's kind of thinking about all of the elements that go into your procedure and your technology, and kind of picking out, what might be of potential interest to them, and exploring that. And then just listening to what they have to say as well. But there's usually something that you can parse out that will be meaningful to them.
Sick or not sick? Great job, Beth. April, thank you very much. I'm seeing a couple of comments here. Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. I, on behalf of the Medical Devices Group and all that will listen to this broadcast afterward, I'm very grateful for you sharing your expertise with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Beth Brooks and April, thank you very much.